The purchase of Alaska has been seen as one of the greatest deals in U.S. history. So why did people at the time call the purchase Seward's Folly? Russia took its first steps towards becoming an empire when a young Russian nobleman named Michael Romanov was elected Tsar in 1613. After over 100 years of land acquisitions, the Russian Empire was founded in 1721 and continued its expansion across Siberia. This expansion was motivated by their lucrative fur trade and religious fervor in wanting to spread the Russian Orthodox Christian faith to the heathens in the east. 20 years later, a Danish navigator called Vitus Bering led a Russian expedition from the Siberian city of Ohutsk and landed in Alaska near the modern-day village of Yakutat. The strait the party crossed still bears his name, although Vitus reportedly died of scurvy in December the same year. The Russians filled their ship with fur seals, foxes, and sea otters that were abundant in the area and returned to Russia. Soon Russian hunters were making regular trips to Alaska, unfortunately exposing the native population to foreign diseases. In 1784, the first permanent Russian colony in Alaska, called Three Saints Bay, was established by Grigory Shelikov on Kodiak Island. Maintaining the small Russian settlements in Alaska with its sparse population of around 800 was not an easy task. Communication between these remote communities and the Russian capital, which at the time was St. Petersburg, was a key issue. Another problem with Alaska is that significant agriculture was not possible that far north, which meant it was not feasible to send large numbers of settlers. The Russian colonists started to explore further south, looking to trade food that could not be grown in Alaska. They established trade relations with the Spanish in California, and in 1812, the Russians set up a settlement at Fort Ross. This settlement was not the success the Russians had hoped for, as the foggy and cool coastal summers were not suited to the crops that they needed, and the sea otters that once thrived in the region had almost been hunted to extinction by the 1820s. The Russians decided to sell the Fort Ross settlement, but the British and Mexicans were uninterested in buying. Eventually, in 1841, John Sutter, an American immigrant, bought the fort for $30,000, although he never settled the bill. Sutter used the materials and tools of Fort Ross to develop Sutter's Fort, where his crew would accidentally find gold when constructing a mill. Sutter also made it into the history books with the Sutter gun, a mobile cannon that came with the sale of Fort Ross and was originally a Russian device. In March of 2022, a Russian lawmaker suggested reclaiming Fort Ross as retribution for U.S. sanctions. At the time, Russia had other pressing issues to deal with. In 1853, Russia, Britain, France, and the Ottoman Turks clashed due to the conflict of powers in the Middle East. Adding to these issues were Russia's demands of protection for Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire, and a dispute with France over the privileges of certain religious groups in Palestine. Britain, France, and Piedmont Sardinia sided with the Ottomans against Russia, and most of the fighting took place in Crimea. This war was poorly managed by everyone involved, and both sides lost around 250,000 men, most of them to disease. When Austria threatened to oppose Russia and join the fight in 1856, Russia was forced to accept peace terms. This conflict was as costly as it was disastrous, and Russia had to rethink its expansion strategy seriously. The Alaskan settlement was no longer profitable since the Russians had hunted the sea otters to the brink of extinction, and there was little else that they felt they could trade. Alaska had become a financial liability, and it was costly and logistically difficult to send supplies to the territory with little return for the effort. Russia's dealings with the local Unangan tribes had been relatively peaceful, but the Tlingit people resisted the invaders and disrupted their supply chains with bouts of violence. The ruling classes of Russia had begun to see expansion into Asia as being more favorable. The American philosophy of manifest destiny, along with competition from the British Hudson Bay Company, meant that Russian control of any territories across the Pacific was unlikely. Russia decided to sell its Alaskan colony to the United States. However, in 1861, the U.S. Civil War broke out, and continued discussions of land acquisition with Russia were ended. After the war ended in 1865, Russian Emperor Alexander II instructed his ambassador, Baron Eduard de Stockel, to open negotiations for the sale of the Alaskan territories. Through an intermediary, politician and journalist Thurlow Weed, Stockel met with the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward. Seward had wanted to acquire Alaska to continue the expansion of the U.S. and wrote in 1848, "Our population is destined to roll resistless waves to the ice barriers of the North and to encounter Oriental civilization on the shores of the Pacific." Stoeckel did not know this at their private meeting in 1867 and withheld an offer until Seward expressed interest. For America, Alaska held great potential for the fish and fur trade and establishing ties with Asia, namely China and Japan. On March 29, 1867, the treaty was finalized and signed the following day. Russia ended its 125-year occupation of Alaska and ceded all of its territories there for the sum of $7.2 million, which meant every acre was purchased for around 2 cents. The reaction of this purchase was varied amongst Americans. Some were supportive, thinking it was the first steps towards the annexation of Canada. Others, mainly newspapers, derided the decision, calling it Seward's Folly and Seward's ICEBOX. Most, however, were ambivalent. Aside from churches, all real estate in Alaska became American property. And on October 18, 1867, Alaska was officially American territory. America gained around 370 million acres of pristine wilderness, 220 million acres of what are now wildlife refuges and federal parks. Seward's desire for the territories in Alaska turned out to be very profitable for the United States, earning them billions of dollars in petroleum, gold, platinum, copper, zinc, lead, timber, fur, whale oil, and fish. Alaska also proved to be a valuable military asset, with bases in Anchorage and Fairbanks. In Russia, many people felt it was foolish to sell what turned out to be a very profitable piece of land. During the Soviet era, propaganda attempted to discredit the imperialist age by highlighting its mistakes, like the sale of Alaska that they wrongly attributed to Catherine the Great. In the early 1990s, a Russian rock band called Lyub further spread this disinformation by including the lyric, "Catherine, you did wrong," in their song Don't Play the Fool, America. There are some Russians who still hope for Alaska to be returned to Russian control. Some claim that the U.S. is only renting Alaska from the Russians and will one day return it. In 2017, Konstantin Shugayev's company re-examined historical documents to try and find any errors that might mean Russia still has a claim to the Alaskan territories. Their investigation claimed that the sale took place on the day which the powers of the U.S. House of Representatives ended. They alleged that the Senate did not approve the sale, and it was therefore illegal. Today, there are Russians who still consider the sale of Alaska as a mistake, while it remains one of the most successful land acquisitions in U.S. history. Hindsight is everything, though. Of course, there is another side to the Alaska purchase story, which is the 100,000 people who lived in Alaska when the Russians arrived. Given the small number of Russians who had settled in Alaska, how did they claim land ownership? The Russians ruled mainly through brutality and fear, controlling the population by destroying their kayaks and hunting equipment and taking children and leaders as hostages. They Christianized some local leaders and used them to enforce their regime. The Russians also brought cannons and firearms with them to subdue the locals. By the time Russia ceded Alaska to the U.S., there were around 50,000 indigenous people left and 1,421 descendants of Russian men and indigenous women. Only 483 Russians lived in Alaska at the time of the sale, and the native Alaskans had been subjected to over a century of enslavement, murder, and death from European diseases. When the United States took control, they were still engaging in military conflicts with the Native Americans and saw the indigenous people of Alaska as potential enemies. From 1867 to 1884, Alaska was made a military district and was known as the Department of Alaska. The indigenous Alaskans did not feel that the Alaskan Purchase was valid, as they still had the titles of the territory and had not lost a war or ceded any lands. They saw the deal as a sale of the rights to negotiate with the native populations. However, the U.S. refused to acknowledge any claims and did not give them U.S. citizenship, meaning they could not vote, own property, file for mining claims, or have any rights granted to the Americans who emigrated there. The indigenous people were also affected by the 1860s campaign by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which partnered with the missionary societies and started to wipe out indigenous languages and lifestyles, including their religion, ceremonies, art, dance, and music. It wasn't until 1924 that the Indian Citizenship Act allowed Native Alaskans to claim U.S. citizenship. In 1936, the amended Indian Reorganization Act allowed all Alaskan tribal governments to reform. The Anti-Discrimination Act of 1945 then banned overt discrimination, such as signs stating "No natives need apply" and "No dogs or natives allowed." Finally, in 1959, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Alaska Statehood Act, making Alaska the 49th state of the Union. The Alaskans began to be recognized as rightful owners of the land due to a clause stating that the U.S. declined any rights to lands under native title. Of course, they did not concede the whole territory, despite the Alaskans still having a claim. In 1971, just over 100 years since the U.S. had purchased Alaska from the Russians, President Richard Nixon gave $1 billion to the native populations. The U.S. also relinquished 44 million acres of federal land back to the original occupants, after a land claims task force chaired by William L. Aguirre Hensley pitched ideas about resolving the issue of the historical treatment of natives in Alaska. While it still took over 100 years for the indigenous Alaskans to receive reparations for past mistreatments, it was still less time than the Russians had occupied Alaska. Whatever the feelings about the past, William H. Seward's acquisition of Alaska would eventually bring democracy and recognition to the people of Alaska. Who knows where they would stand if Russia had held on to control in the area? To learn more about Russia, check out our book, Russian History, a captivating guide to the history of Russia, including events such as the Mongol invasion, the Napoleonic invasion, reforms of Peter the Great, the fall of the Soviet Union, and more. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.